Do you realize that in our nation, the United States of America, every 26 minutes there's one suicide? That's on an average. That would mean that in the course of the Sabbath service that we're having here this morning, that in the course of this Sabbath service, across the nation, statistically, 4 people will have taken their own life. Now that is a very tragic statistic, and in many ways an incredible thing, but not so incredible when you think about it for a little bit, because for a number of years, Valium has been one of the most, if not the most, often prescribed drugs in this country. People seeking to deal with depression, with being overwhelmed with life and an inability somehow to cope. Now, that's not something that is limited only to the society around us, because many of us in God's church have struggled with and dealt with problems of discouragement, sometimes things that went beyond discouragement to the point of really developing into depression, because discouragement can go beyond simply being a little down, being kind of discouraged, being a little frustrated, which can be a rather momentary thing. It can be, everybody has times when they are frustrated or discouraged, but discouragement can go beyond simple discouragement into becoming a very serious matter of depression, and can become absolutely, totally debilitating. This is something that those in God's church are not immune to, and we're going to notice some examples in the Scripture. Problems, trials, various things can sometimes multiply until it seems that life itself has become overwhelming. Well, I would like for us this morning to understand some things about discouragement and depression to begin with, to focus in, to have a little more clear understanding of some insight that the Scripture gives us in regards to discouragement and depression, and to go beyond simply understanding the problem to focusing in on some specific methods of coping, of dealing with it. And we will note particularly 7 specific things that can be done that are important in terms of coping. Now, why does discouragement become depression? What is it? What produces this overwhelming discouragement and depression? Well, there are various things that can result in this. There's not just any one thing. I think one of the most common, one of the most frequent things that can occur that develops a serious, an overwhelming discouragement and depression can be when a person has come to the point that the goals and tasks before them seem absolutely overwhelming. Being overwhelmed by the tasks and the goals that are immediately ahead of you can be very discouraging and depressing. Now, there are plenty of examples in the Bible of individuals who came to the point of being absolutely overwhelmed at what lay before them. We might just notice a couple of fairly well-known accounts. One, of course, is given in Exodus chapter 14. Now, you're familiar with Exodus 14. This is the story of Israel coming out of Egypt. And God led them out of Egypt in a way that took them down along an area of the Red Sea, where ultimately they came to a spot that there were mountains on 2 sides of them, the Red Sea on the third, the fourth was the way they came in, and they looked up, and here came Pharaoh's army. So they no longer had the fourth option. It was closed to them because this was the This was the direction from which their greatest problem was coming. As they looked at it, they had no way of retreat. Now, they were absolutely overwhelmed with the job that was before them, which was to get out of Egypt. Because we're told in verse 8 of Exodus 14 that the children of Israel went out with a high hand. You know, one of the things about depression is that we can go from the heights of ecstasy and joy to the depths of depression, sometimes in a rather short time. We can go from the highs to the lows. This is what happened to them. They were all excited. They were on and up. And then we're told in verse 9, the Egyptians pursued after them, all the horses and the chariots of Pharaoh and his horsemen and his army, and overtook them, encamping by the sea beside Pi-hahiroth, before Baal-zephon. And Pharaoh drew near, and the children of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them, and they were sore afraid, and they cried out unto the Lord, and they said to Moses, you brought us out here to die. Is the reason you brought us out here because there weren't enough graves in Egypt? You brought us out here in the wilderness? Didn't we tell you, verse 12, leave us alone and let us serve the Egyptians? We were better off to have stayed there. Now, notice what had happened. Here they came out with a high hand. They were all excited. They were enthused. This great opportunity had opened up for them. It was the chance of a lifetime. They had been oppressed. They had been put down. They were they weren't free to pursue their dreams at all. Their life was endangered. Pharaoh had at an earlier time even tried to wipe out the male population, at least among the children. They had encountered unbelievable difficulties, struggles, and obstacles. But here finally they were coming out, they were all excited, they were all enthused, they got out there, and what happened? You know, they thought they had left Egypt and the problems behind. They got out there and they turned around, and who was coming down the road? You know, they saw this cloud of dust. And it wasn't the cavalry coming to rescue them either. It was Pharaoh and his horsemen. And immediately they just got on this toboggan slide and just went from the heights of joy to the depths of despair. And they said, oh no, we're going to die. We told you, just leave us alone. Why didn't we just stay back there? We were better off not to even try to change our circumstances. You know, if we'd just given up and stayed in Egypt. You know, sometimes people drop out of life that way. They take the approach, they say, well, if you don't try, you can't fail. So, you know, I won't try. Because what if I try and then something happens? So they just kind of give up. Well, the reality is, of course, if you don't try, you can't succeed. If you don't try, you've already failed. But here they were, ready to throw in the towel, ready to give up, ready to quit, absolutely in despair. Because what they saw looked so overwhelming, they didn't see a way out. They did not see a way out. They did not see how the problem could be coped with. The problem seemed so overwhelming as to be insoluble. And so they gave up. There are other places we could go. We could look in Numbers chapter 13. Another classic case. You remember the story? The spies went into the land, the promised land here. Israel, the purpose of their coming out of Egypt was not to live in the desert. The purpose of their coming out of Egypt was to go to the promised land. So they came within sight of the promised land, and they sent 12 spies, one from each tribe, one of the leaders from each tribe, over into the promised land, spy the thing out, come back and report as to the best way to go in. The spies came back, and they said, look, it is a land flowing with milk and honey, just like we were told, but there are problems. When God told us He was going to bring us to a land flowing with milk and honey, He didn't mention there were giants in the land that lived in great fortified cities that had big iron chariots. Why, these people make us look like grasshoppers. God didn't tell us that there were problems to be overcome. There were obstacles that lay between us and receiving the inheritance we were promised. And we're told, when the news was brought as to the problems and the obstacles, here the people went from excitement and joy that they were ready to enter into the promised land. This is why they had been traveling through the wilderness. And in Numbers 14:1, when they got the news, all the congregation lifted up their voice and cried, and the people wept that night. And all the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron. And the whole congregation said, "Would to God we had died in the land of Egypt. We wish we had just died in the wilderness. We wish we were dead. You brought us out here and we're going to be wiped out. Oh, woe is us." Just from the heights to the depths. Because what lay before them was so overwhelming, it seemed impossible. It seemed like, how in the world can they do it? And you can notice account after account. We just noticed briefly here in Numbers 21, verse 4. They journeyed from Mount Hor by way of the Red Sea to compass the land of Edom. And the soul of the people was much discouraged because of the way, and the people spoke against God and against Moses, saying, "Why have you brought us out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There's no bread, neither is there any water. We hate this stuff that we have, this white bread, as they call the manna. There's no real food out here. There's nothing that we can see. The only thing we've got is this manna that God's given us, and we're sick and tired of that. We don't want that anymore. We want something else." They were discouraged because of the way. The road looked hard. There were obstacles. They took a longer way around than what they had anticipated. They were looking at going straight through. They ran into obstacles, and Moses said, "All right, instead of going and fighting the Edomites, we will just go around them." And here they were within almost sight of the promised land, and then they had to take a detour. And they were discouraged because they hadn't expected that. That just seemed so overwhelming. They were tired and they were ready to get where they were going, and now they had to take a detour. One of the things that can frequently lead to serious discouragement, to overwhelming discouragement and depression, is being overwhelmed by the goal and the task before us. What we have to do. These can be health problems, they can be financial problems, they can be any number of things, but it amounts to the fact that what we have in front of us, staring us in the face, seems so overwhelming. It seems so overwhelming that we think, "I can't do it." And we're ready to give up and quit. Well, we could go through example after example. We could spend the whole sermon just on the frequency with which people have been overwhelmed. You face things that are overwhelming. Every human being at one time or another faces things that are overwhelming. You might go back in the gospel accounts, particularly in the book of John, and read of a time when Jesus faced something before him that was overwhelming. And see what he did about it. We're told that there was a time when he was very depressed. Just felt horrible, just overwhelmed. Read the account there in the gospel account that Jesus described the way he felt. In fact, we're told in Matthew 26:38, there on the night prior to his crucifixion, he told the disciples, he took Peter and James and John in verse 37, and he began to be sorrowful and very heavy. Really, the weight of discouragement and depression began to come on him. And he told them, verse 38, he said, "My soul is exceeding sorrowful even unto death. Wait here and watch with me. You know, does Jesus Christ know what it is to face something that seems absolutely overwhelming? What He had that lay before Him was a horrible next few hours. And He knew that everything depended not merely on His doing it, but on His doing it perfectly, without making even one slip-up, in thought or in deed. Now, you talk about pressure. That's what He faced. He knows what it's like to face incredible pressure. He knows what it's like to feel like you just can't go any further. That's a good place to go. Well, that's one source of deep discouragement and depression, is being overwhelmed by the magnitude of the task ahead of us. Now, there are other things. That's not the only thing that can lead to discouragement and depression. That is one major factor. That's one thing that often brings us to that point of being overwhelmed by the magnitude of what lies ahead. Sometimes other things can come in. Sometimes unexpected results. An unexpected result leads to self-pity, which bogs down into depression. Let's notice an example in 1 Kings 19. 1 Kings 19. Now, you remember the story in chapter 18. I will briefly rehearse it, chapters 17 and 18. Chapter 17 and 18 was Elijah's confrontation with the priests of Baal. Elijah confronted the priests of Baal, and you remember the story there on Mount Carmel, and God sent down fire and consumed the sacrifice. You remember the story? The priests of Baal were out there, and Elijah had told them, he called the people together, and he said, I want you to choose as to whom you're going to serve. If Baal be God, then serve him, and if God be God, then serve him. You know, how long are we going to halt between two opinions? Are we going to be divided over this issue? Elijah said. So all the priests of Baal, hundreds of them, they came out there, and Elijah invited them to go first. He said, we're going to have it made evident as to who is the source of real power. He said, we're going to both offer a sacrifice out here. We're going to both build an altar and offer a sacrifice, and we're going to stop short of doing one thing. Neither of us are going to bring any fire. And we're going to call on the God that we serve to send fire to consume the sacrifice. So you remember the story. The priests of Baal got out there and they built theirs and they whooped it up and danced around and jumped and danced a jig and had a real, they had a real deal. I mean, you read out there and they were whooping it up and rolling on the ground and shouting hallelujah and all the stuff that they do, and they really, whatever they shouted to Baal, and they really got excited. So some of them started jumping up on the altar and falling over backward, and they had a real deal. Some of you may have been to a service or so like that years ago. I went to one about 25 years ago that didn't get quite as far out as the ones that Elijah describes, but it came close. Came close enough to send me scurrying out the back door and not to come back. But anyway, none of their gyrations and gymnastics did them any good because there wasn't any answer. And Elijah, of course, now here you meet Elijah, you think, man, a man of his spiritual strength and power and stamina, a man of faith, a man of absolute conviction. Here he was taking on the whole nation, as it were. And you think, boy, he is a man of unshakable faith and conviction. And he just kind of egged them on. You remember the story, that they were jumping and dancing, and Elijah was standing over there saying, you better shout a little louder. Maybe he can't hear you. Hey, guys, I bet he took a trip. He'll be back in a little while. Just keep it up. You can go through and read, the thing. He suggested several alternatives as to where Baal might have been, He suggested in verse 27, we're told he mocked them. And he suggested, maybe he'd gone to the bathroom and wouldn't be back for a while. Maybe he was talking to somebody and had to wait. And he had a lot of helpful suggestions to them as to where Baal might be. And I'm sure they didn't appreciate any of his suggestions, but those were the ones he made nevertheless. And he, here was an individual with supreme confidence, you think. And it's obvious, as we read that. And then when the time came, they had done all this to no avail. Elijah went, and at the time of the evening sacrifice, he built the altar, put the animal on the altar, called a short prayer to God in faith and in confidence in God. And before that, he'd even soaked the thing with water, 12 barrels of water, just to make sure nobody thought it was just kind of the heat of the day had just kind of set off this spark somehow. He wanted it obvious, and all of a sudden here this whoosh, this mighty flame, this bolt of lightning out of heaven that shot down and consumed the sacrifice, the altar, the stones, lapped up all the water all around, and just left kind of a blackened crater where it used to be. There was no question as to who answered. And so anyway, the priests of Baal were taken out and executed. You remember the story. Well, when you get to 1 Kings 19, we're told that Ahab went back home and he told Jezebel all that Elijah had done. Now, can you go through and you get the feel for Ahab and what a mealy-mouthed sort of character he was, and you can imagine how he hated to come in and face Jezebel and break the news. But anyway, he did. And Jezebel sent a message to Elijah saying, I'm going to kill you for this. I have put a price on your head, and by this time tomorrow, you're going to be dead, Buster. And you know what Elijah did when he got the news? Now here he was. He had just come through this event. He was on a high. He felt like, we've won. It's over with. And then he gets the news. She's got soldiers coming for you. You're going to be dead by this time tomorrow. And Elijah took off. Have you ever noticed, and I think those of us who've been in the church over a period of years can look back, and there have been times when we have confronted something, and it was like our faith was strong, and we knew that we knew, and there was absolute confidence, and we were close to God. And then, on the heels of something, here something else comes up, and maybe not even that dissimilar. And yet somehow we just wind up overwhelmed and we're afraid of what's going to come. How can you go from a time of supreme confidence and faith to a time of doubt? Well, that's very possible as a human being. So Elijah took off. And he left his servant behind him. He headed for Judah, which was, of course, a different kingdom. And he went down there and he got a day's journey into the wilderness. And he sat down under a juniper tree. Now, this is a little desert shrub. You're out in the middle of the desert, and this thing is about all there is that's out there. So here he was out in the middle of this hot desert, and he found a little desert shrub, and he sat down under that for the shade he could get there, and he asked God, he says, let me die. I'm ready to die. I can't take it anymore. It's enough. Take my life away. I know, that all my fathers, all my ancestors, they're all dead, and I'm no better than they are. I'm going to die someday, and I just soon get it over with. Just let me go ahead and die now. I just can't take it anymore. Now here he was. In a matter of a few days' time, really in a couple of days, he had gone from seemingly the height of confidence to being so depressed and discouraged that he just wanted to die. I just don't feel like I can handle it anymore. Things didn't go the way he expected. And it really hit him like a bolt out of the blue, and he just became He began to feel sorry for himself. Why me? If you come on down a little later, he told God, he said, he told God, verse 10, he says, I've been very jealous, very zealous for the eternal God. The children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, they've thrown down your altars, they've slain your prophets with the sword, and I'm the only one left. And now they're trying to kill me. So he really had just become discouraged and depressed. Things didn't go the way he expected. And he began to feel sorry for himself, and he thought, I'm the only one. Nobody else. I'm the only one, and now they're after me, and I just give up. I just can't take it anymore. Now, he wasn't really the only one left. God makes that plain on down verse 18. But you see, that's the problem when we begin to bog down in self-pity. We develop a distorted sense of reality. We get a distorted sense of reality, and we think that things are somehow even worse than they are. Things didn't go the way we expected. And we're vulnerable to that when we have gone from being when we thought everything was coming together, and then a few unexpected things happened. It seemed like the bottom fell out. Things didn't go the way we expected. And then to just slide down into this self-pitying attitude, get reality all distorted as Elijah had. See, he just come to the point where he just, look, I'm the only one left. Well, he wasn't really the only one left, but in his mind at that point, he convinced himself that that's the way it really was. And it just couldn't handle it anymore. Other places we could go. Real classic case is the book of Jonah. Now, Jonah was the reluctant prophet. Jonah really was not anxious to go and do what God wanted him to do to begin with. Sometimes we're not real anxious to do what God has in mind for us. Jonah was told by God to go to Nineveh and preach. Tell the people to repent. And Jonah didn't want to tell them to repent. He just assumed God go ahead and fry the Ninevites and get it over with. Well, you remember the story. God told him to go to Nineveh, so he hopped the first boat heading towards Spain, which was put him in exactly the opposite direction. And, of course, God has ways of getting our attention. Jonah found himself out in the middle of a storm. Before all was said and done, they threw him overboard. Then that wasn't the end of the story. A big fish came along, swallowed him up. And this was not your ordinary run-of-the-mill fish. This was one especially prepared for the job, and Jonah found himself down on the inside. And not a real pleasant way to spend 3 days and 3 nights. You've seen the placard up sometime that says, "Old fishermen never die, they just smell that way." If you've been around, can you imagine what it'd be like to be down inside of an old fish for 3 days and 3 nights? I mean, if you think it's an old fishy clothes or an old fishy boat has an odor to it, can you imagine being down inside the thing? So just one of the smaller problems that Jonah encountered for 3 days and 3 nights. But here he was, and down in the middle of this thing. And of course he prayed to God. When you get in this kind of predicament, you're hoping that God is somewhere to be found. Now earlier, Jonah was just as soon trying to get somewhere that God couldn't find him, but now he was hoping that God would be able to find him. And of course, God was able to find him, and God had taken care of it. This fish made the circuit up and came down and spit Jonah out right at the right spot. And Jonah came into Nineveh proclaiming that 40 days and Nineveh is going to be overthrown. Came in preaching a message. And an amazing thing happened, the thing that Jonah least expected, and that is, never had happened to a prophet before, but the people of Nineveh believed him. Now, I just can't help but wonder the fact that Jonah was spit up on shore by a great fish, and what the Ninevites normally worshipped was the fish god, word didn't spread rather quickly that there was something astounding about this. Can you imagine what Jonah must have looked like and smelled like when he came walking into town after traveling inside the fish for 3 days and 3 nights? Word got around rather quickly, and the amazing thing was the people believed him. And they proclaimed a fast, and they really began to get serious. And God saw their attitude, and He said, I'm not going to go ahead and do what I said. In chapter 4, verse 1, it displeased Jonah exceedingly, and he was very angry. And he said, God, this is what I was afraid of. This is why I didn't want to come to begin with, because I just was afraid that somehow or another they would weasel out of it, and I wanted to see them get it. He said, I'm sick of this. I just want to die. Verse 3. It's better for me. He says, I ask you, just let me die. Take my life from me. Jonah went out of the city and he sat down, made him a little booth, a little place out of some branches there, and he sat down under the shade, and wasn't much shade, but he sat under what there was to watch and see what was going to happen. And God made a gourd come up and shade Jonah. Jonah liked that. It was kind of a nice gourd. He was happy to have it. He was very glad. We're told in verse 6, this really brightened his day up when this gourd came up and gave him some shade. And then God prepared a worm the next day. The worm came and smote the gourd, and it withered. And then the sun rose and hot east wind came. And Jonah was just ready to collapse from heat exhaustion. And he wanted to die again. Now he was totally depressed. And he told God he was mad because God had taken his gourd away. Verse 9. God said to Jonah, do you do well to be angry for the gourd? And Jonah said, I do well to be angry, even unto death. Well, you took my gourd away, and I just don't like that. I just wish you'd just go ahead and let me die if you're going to take my gourd away. God said, well, you had a lot of pity on that gourd, didn't you? Now, what did you do to produce the gourd? You didn't make it grow. It came up in the night, and it was gone in the night. Yet you really got attached to that gourd. And you're all depressed because you didn't get to keep the gourd. He said, now, you were pretty attached to that gourd, and you didn't have anything to do with making it. It was here today and gone tomorrow. Don't you think I ought to have a little pity on the Ninevites? I had a lot to do with making them, and they've been here longer than a day. I'm kind of attached to them. You were attached to the gourd and mad at the worm for destroying it. But the whole point is, Jonah became very depressed, overwhelmed, discouraged. Things didn't go the way he expected, and he just became eaten up with self-pity, feeling sorry for himself because things didn't happen the way he anticipated. Unexpected results, unexpected difficulties. Not overwhelming tasks, but just things that were unexpected, things that came up out of the blue that weren't expected, that just led into kind of a self-focused, self-pity that just slid right down into depression. Now, let's go on. Those are a couple of things, but let's look at something else. We mentioned goals and tasks seeming overwhelming. Well, there's the opposite of that. The opposite of having overwhelming goals and tasks is having no goals, no tasks, just wandering aimlessly without any sense of purpose, a lack of a sense of purpose. Kind of an aimlessness in life. That can result in losing a sense of any purpose can result in great depression. If you look at many times some of the individuals who commit suicide, if you were to assemble a list, you would find that many times some of seemingly the people who have everything. People who have everything. Some of them movie stars, the beauty queens, the various ones. You think of an individual like Marilyn Monroe, for instance. Now, she had popularity, she had fame, she had money, she had the things that most people think they would want. She was acclaimed as being beautiful. People thought she was beautiful. She had money. She had fame. She knew all kinds of famous people. Her needs in terms of food, clothing, and shelter, those weren't even issues. You look at many different ones many people who have committed suicide, many people who have had great battles with depression have been people who seemingly had everything. But there was a lack of sense of purpose in their life. Now, some of that we find Solomon comments on that in the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes chapter 2. Solomon decided he was going to try everything. And he tried all kinds of things. And let's notice in verse 10 of Ecclesiastes 2. He said, "Whatever my eyes desired, I kept not from them. I withheld not my heart from any joy. My heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my portion of all my labor." He said, anything I could think of, I did it. Anything I saw I wanted, I got. I was in a position to do everything, and I tried it. And so Solomon went along for several years this way. People read that and they think, boy, that'd be great. It's like so many times they read of individuals and they think, boy, if I had his money, if I had, her money or her looks or his position, prestige, famous friends, if I had these things, my problems would be solved. Solomon said, whatever I saw that I wanted, I got. In verse 11, after a few years, I looked at all the things that I had done and on the labor that I had labored to do, and it was all vanity and vexation of spirit, and there was no profit under the sun. In verse 17, he says, therefore I hated life, because the work that is wrought under the sun is grievous unto me. It's all vanity and vexation of spirit. He tried everything, and this was great, and boy, he was going to do this and do that and do that. And after a while, he got to looking around, and he just lost any purpose. He lost interest. The things that most people look to or have to work to achieve, Solomon didn't have to work to achieve it. He didn't have to struggle in order to provide for his family or to provide food or clothing or shelter. Now there is what is called, and perhaps you've seen it sometimes charted out, what is called a hierarchy of needs. A lot of times we hear people talk about, well, I needed this or I needed that. And of course, many times we don't differentiate between needs and wants. And there is what is called a hierarchy of needs. As we achieve certain needs, our attention gets focused on the next step up. Now, Solomon had accomplished many of the things that would normally be goals and objectives. This is something that often besets people, a lack of a sense of purpose, a sense of aimlessness. There's nothing to strive for, because we have a need to accomplish and to strive for. And when a person loses a sense of purpose. Now, this is a factor sometimes in many of the celebrity suicides. They come to the point that Solomon did. They all these things. It's amazing how your perspective of needs change. I can remember as a child, I never knew my grandfather, or actually either of my grandfathers. One of my grandmothers was living when I was a child, and she lived with us for a number of years. And I can remember the things that I knew about my grandfather. She told me he had died in 1936. And when she would speak of him, she would mention various things. And one of the things that she mentioned on various occasions is what a good provider he was. Well, I began to think about that in later years, and I realized what she meant by that was that he provided food, clothing, and shelter. Because you see, those were the things that people were struggling for. Now, he never provided electricity. They never had electricity. as long as he was living. They never had indoor plumbing. You know, they never had a washing machine or a clothes dryer. They never had many of the things that if you were to say what did he provide? Well, we always had plenty to eat. And that's a very basic thing. You see, in our society, we take that for granted. We assume we're going to have plenty to eat. We assume that we're not going to go hungry, that we're going to have a place to live. But this was not always something that was taken for granted. This was something that meant struggling. Now, there wasn't much cash money. If you were trying to sell, if your cash consisted of what you made from selling the cotton that grew on probably the cotton portion of the farm was maybe about 100 acres. The cotton that you're going to make in the worn-out red clay hills of North Louisiana on about 100 acres is not much cotton, and cotton didn't bring very much in the 1920s and 1930s. Some of you sitting here remember what it bought. If that's where all your cash came from, you weren't going to have much cash at the end of the year. You see, our concept of what we need can greatly vary and greatly change. What she remembered, because you see, she knew what it was like not to have some of those most basic needs made. Because when she was, her parents died and she was an orphan back in 1889 when she was 4 years old, and her uncle came and picked her and three sisters up and brought them down to Mississippi, and he had 12 kids of his own and was a sharecropper in a one-room cabin in Mississippi. So, when you struggle to provide food, and then all of a sudden you got plenty of food and food's not a problem, you think, well, boy, this is great. But see, the goals and the ambitions may be very simple. But as life has become more complex, we take a lot more things for granted. What we think we need has reached a far higher level, a higher plane than people for generations, for millennia and centuries ever thought of. They struggle to make food, clothing, and shelter. We take those things for granted. We have those things, and so further up the line. A lot of cases, individuals who seemingly have everything except a goal. They have everything except a purpose. Because the things that maybe people in other generations have had as their goal and their purpose, those things come so easily they don't have to worry about that. And they have nothing beyond it. This has been the case many times for those who are even some of the affluent, some of the rich and the successful, a lack of a sense of purpose. They became like Solomon to the point that they hated life. Everything just seemed like it was useless. That's another source of discouragement and depression. A sense of purposelessness. A lack of a sense of purpose. A fourth aspect, and one that we should not in any way discount, is the very real role of Satan the devil. In 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8, we're told to be sober and be vigilant, because our adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, walks about seeking whom he might devour. Satan is looking for someone to devour. Now we're told in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 2 that the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that now works in the children of disobedience. He's called the prince of the power of the air. Mr. Armstrong used to liken that to Satan broadcasting on a certain wavelength. And we can become receptive to that and tune that in. One of the wavelengths on which he broadcasts is that of doubt and discouragement, despondency. He's going about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he might devour. So Satan can play a very real role in deepening depression. Our goals and tasks can seem overwhelming. Or sometimes things just don't go the way we expect, and it leads us down into self-pity, which develops into depression. Sometimes there's just a sense of aimlessness, a lack of purpose, a lack of something to strive for. And there is the very real role of Satan himself. Well, what can you do about it? Various things can bring it about, but where do you go from there? How do you get out of it? It's very important. We're going to note briefly several things. To start with, there are physical necessities. You know, God did not neglect the physical necessities when He dealt with Elijah, when Elijah was very depressed. Elijah came out into the wilderness, we're told. We read this earlier in 1 Kings 19, verse 4, and he sat down under the juniper bush and wanted to die. And then verse 5, we found that he lay down and slept. Now, often one of the things that happens when a person becomes very depressed, sometimes in some cases, there are often problems with a sleep cycle. One factor, often a person gets to where they're wanting to just kind of withdraw, to just sleep. They lose their appetite. They just want to withdraw and pull back. Just don't feel like making the effort. It's one of the symptoms of depression. Now, God sent the angel and He woke Elijah up. He says, "Get up. Wake up. Not going to let you just lay here and sleep. Wake up and eat." So God told him to get up and eat. And there was some food that was prepared. And so he got up and he ate, and he wanted to go back to bed again. So he lay back down. And the angel of the Lord came back and he woke him up again. He said, "All right, now you need to get back up and you need to eat. I've got something for you to do. Got a journey." Now there are three things that come here. One was just sleeping your life away is not going to solve the problem. There is a need, and sometimes this has to be externally imposed. We need sometimes the push to get up, to realize that we do need to do. Yes, we need rest, and we need adequate rest, but we've got to do something. There are physical aspects, and we need to get up. We need to eat properly. That's one of the things that sometimes, because these problems, can deepen the depression. Then the next thing, God gave him something specific, tangible, and physical to do. To take a trip, to take a journey. And he was going to take a hike. It was going to take him to Horeb. He needed something to do. It was something simple, something that did not require a lot of great mental and emotional prowess. It was a physical thing, a very simple thing. And of course, exercise is very important in terms of breaking the depression cycle. Sleep and diet and exercise are the proper regulation of those things is very important. Now, right along with that, I might just mention the statement that is mentioned in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 18, where it says, "Be not drunk with wine wherein is excess, but be filled with the Spirit." You know, sometimes looking to some sort of chemical quick fix, alcohol has and of course there are now various other alternatives that do the same thing. People sometimes think that's going to solve their problem. And that, of course, does not. And in reality, alcohol chemically is a depressant. And so if you're depressed and you drink, you're going to wind up more depressed than ever. It may seemingly relieve the pressure for a while because the mind becomes sedated and you don't care in the same way. But when the effects of the alcohol wear off, the depression is going to be deeper. So those things are not solutions. We find that there are physical things that contribute, but that's not all there is. Let's go beyond that. You know, in terms of coping with depression, we see there are various things that can bring it about. There are some things that cope with it. First thing is not to neglect the physical necessities. the proper regulation of our diet, our sleep, and our exercise, and the avoidance of mind-altering chemicals that can, in reality, make the depression deeper in the long run. Those not neglecting the physical necessities is very important. The second thing that is very important in coping is the ability to see, to grasp, to comprehend the power of God. You see, that is the key to putting our problems in perspective. That's the key to putting our problems in perspective, is to see the power of God. We could go many places. You could go through Job's problems and find that this is what God ultimately did for Job. You could go back to 2 Kings chapter 6. I'll just recount it for brevity's sake, but you can read it, 2 Kings 6, 13 through 16. You remember this was the story of Elisha. And the Syrian army had been sent to capture Elisha and to take him as a captive. And Elisha's servant woke up early that morning, went out and looked, and he came running back in and he says, "Alas, my master, what shall we do? The Syrian army's got us surrounded." And he was all upset. He figured, we're done for now. And Elisha said, "Don't worry about it. There's more with us than there are with them." And the servant said, "You haven't looked out the window yet. I've already been outside. I've seen how many of them there are, and there's 2 of us." And Elisha said, "Don't worry. There's more with us than there are with him." And so Elisha prayed and asked God to perform a miracle. And for a few split seconds, that servant's eyes were opened, and for a matter of seconds, he actually beheld the spirit realm. He could actually see the spirit world. And what he saw was horses and chariots of fire just absolutely covering the mountains all around. The Syrians thought they had Elisha surrounded. What they didn't know was God had them surrounded. And it gave a perspective to the servant, something he had never dawned on him, because you see, he was walking by sight and not by faith. It's important to comprehend the power of God, to see the power of God. We're told in the 23rd Psalm, very familiar section of Scripture, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." Why not? Well, the verse goes on to say, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for Thou art with me. Thy rod and Thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies." Why wasn't he afraid? Because God was there. Why wasn't he afraid going where he had to go? Because he knew he wasn't going alone. He had a deep awareness of the presence and power of God. And you see, that's crucial if we're going to break out, to see the power of God. People are overwhelmed. The Israelites at the Red Sea were overwhelmed because they lost sight of the power of God. When we're overwhelmed by our obstacles, it's because our focus is on the wrong thing. All we can see is the obstacle. How long does it take God to deal with the impossible? How long does it take God to, we look at something and say, that's impossible. How do you get out of there? You got the Red Sea on one side, the mountain on the other, and Pharaoh's army coming at you. That's the only way out. Well, no, it's not. God can open up the Red Sea and bring you across dry shod. Never thought of that way out, did you? That would not be an alternative that would just normally occur to you. I know how we're going to get out of here. We'll just dry up the sea and go across. Nobody thought of that one, but God did. See, God has things in mind that you and I would never think of in a million years. So don't limit God. Don't limit God. We're told in Exodus that the Israelites limited the Holy One of Israel by unbelief. We can limit God by unbelief. We box Him into a corner, and we find it difficult to grasp His power. We have to see the power of God. In 1 Kings 19, you find when God brought Elijah out these 40 days into the wilderness after he got to the end of his hike, then God introduced Himself to Elijah and introduced some things about His power, and conveyed the fact that God sometimes speaks in great, powerful, earth-shaking ways, and sometimes God speaks in a still, small voice. Sometimes we have to simply learn to stand still and see the salvation of the eternal. That's what the Israelites were told when they were at the Red Sea. Stand still and see the salvation of the eternal. Because when you come to the end of your rope and there's nothing left for you to do, then don't panic. Stand still and see the salvation of the eternal. So, seeing the power of God is a very important key to coping. A third important key to coping is to cultivate an attitude of gratitude. You know, we're told in Romans chapter 1 that unthankfulness leads into a self-centered, a self-focused approach that takes us away from God. We're told in Romans chapter 1 and verse 21, when they knew God, they glorified Him not as God, neither were thankful. There was a time, we're starting here in Romans 1:21 with some individuals who did know God. Now actually, if you want to trace it back historically, the original time setting of when everybody knew God was right after the flood. Right after the flood of Noah, Noah knew God, his children knew God, his grandchildren knew God, all of them right there in the plains of Ararat knew God. But there were many of them, when they knew God, they didn't glorify Him as God, neither were thankful. And the result was, they became vain in their imagination, and their foolish heart was darkened. And then, professing themselves to be wise, they became as fools, and they began this slide. And this is a slide that can take place. It can take place to sometimes young people who grow up in the church. When they knew God, they didn't glorify Him as God, neither were thankful. The result is they began to drift away from that knowledge of God. They finally come to the point where they lose their understanding, because they didn't take advantage of the opportunity they had when they had it. When they knew God, they didn't appreciate what that knowledge meant. And that's very, very crucial to understand. We find that a lack of gratitude can take us into a very self-centered approach and away from God. The opposite of that is a sense of gratitude, of deep gratitude, thankfulness, and appreciation. In Colossians chapter 2, in verse 6 it says, as you have therefore received Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk you in Him, rooted and builded up in Him, and established in the faith as you have been taught, abounding therein with thanksgiving. Abounding with thanksgiving. We're told in Colossians 4:2, continue in prayer and watch in the same with thanksgiving. Book of Philippians is has various admonitions. We're told in the book of Philippians, chapter 4 and verse 6, be careful for nothing. Don't be filled with care and anxiety about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving. Let your requests be made known unto God. And the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. So we're told, instead of worrying about it, pray about it. Prayer, supplication, with thanksgiving. Because you see, when we begin to count our blessings, when we begin to focus in a thankful way, it changes the direction, it changes our state of mind. It puts us in a state of mind to be receptive to God's communication. We become receptive to God when we begin to count our blessings. And we seek to develop that attitude of gratitude. As we begin to focus in that way, it makes us receptive to what God is doing. It makes us receptive to God's dealing and working in our lives. And so, Paul came to understand in Philippians 4:11, not that I speak in respect of want, I have learned in whatsoever state I am therewith to be content. Now, at the time Paul wrote this, he was a Roman prisoner chained up like a dog. I think sometimes we don't think of that, and Paul says, I've learned in whatsoever state I am therewith to be content. I think I'd have a hard time learning to be content chained up like a dog somewhere. Paul said he'd learned to be content in whatsoever state he was. I know both how to be abased and how to abound. I know everywhere and in all things I'm instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. You see, Paul learned that the way to be content was, instead of worrying about it, pray about it. Prayer, supplication, with thanksgiving. Here was Paul, chained up as a Roman prisoner, counting his blessings. Many, many blessings that we have. Well, we could go on. We could look at other things. So we see not neglecting the physical necessities, seeing, focusing upon the power of God, an attitude of gratitude that we cultivate. Another aspect is the proper perspective of why do we have trials? In Deuteronomy 8, God says that one of the reasons He led Israel through the wilderness those 40 years was to humble them and to prove them. He wanted them to recognize how totally dependent upon Him they were for everything they had, and He wanted to prove them, to find out what was in their heart. What did they really want to do? God allows us to be tried and tested. James says, count it all joy. Why? What's joyful? There's nothing joyful about the trial. That's grievous. But the joy comes from the character that is built and refined in us. James talks about that the trying of our faith works patience, he tells us. In James chapter 1, verses 2 through 7. Developing that character comes from God. And we're told in James 1:12, blessed is the man that endures temptation, that endures trials. When he's tried, he will receive a crown of life, which the Lord has promised to them that love Him. There are other places we could go. We could go back to 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 7, the trial of your faith being much more precious than of gold that perishes, though it be tried with fire, might be found unto praise and honor and glory at the appearing of our Lord Jesus Christ. We could look at many places that talk about that there is a reason why God allows His people to go through trials. God could step in, intervene instantly. Every time we confronted a trial, God could just step in and intervene instantly and remove it, and we would never have to go through trials and difficulties and adversities. God has not chosen to do that. God is working with us to refine us, to teach us, to mold us, to shape us. We need to develop a proper perspective to look at trials and to understand why God may allow us to be in a trial for a period of time. Not that God just looks down and causes problems for us, but God does not just instantly deliver us out of everything that comes along. Sometimes He allows us to be tried and tested. And there are reasons why He may do so. A fifth thing that we need to understand, a fifth key to coping with these trials is going to God for help. Sometimes we go through needless problems because we try to bear the burden ourselves. We're told in 1 Peter 5:7, casting all your cares on Him, for He cares for you. Casting all your cares on Him, for He cares for you. We need to understand that aspect. That sometimes the burden we're carrying may very well be too heavy, but God has told us that we don't need to carry that burden. Cast that burden on Him. Casting all your cares on Him, for He cares for you. Sometimes we hold on. We need to learn how to let go and let God. Sometimes we turn it over only to turn right around and take it back. We get out on our knees to pray and we turn it over to God. We get up and we take it back and take the burden back and go and try to, stumble along struggling under it until we're about ready to fall over. We have to to turn it over, because Jeremiah said in Jeremiah chapter 10 and verse 23, a lesson that Jeremiah deeply understood. He said, "O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man that walks to direct his steps." I can't make it on my own. I don't know the way I ought to go by myself. Oh Lord, the way of man is not in himself. It's not in man that walks to direct his steps. We're told in Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, about acknowledging God in all our ways, and He will direct our paths. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not unto your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct your paths. Casting your cares on Him. Going to God for help. Not trying to carry the whole burden by ourselves. We're overwhelmed. We can't do it. That's right. And you see, that's part of the lesson we all have to learn. We all have limits. We come to the end of our rope. See, God is there. There is help there. God didn't tell us that we've got to carry the whole load ourselves. That's the whole point. We have to learn how inadequate we are, how dependent upon God we are, how much we lack self-sufficiency. That's a vital lesson. And if we never came to this point in our lives, we could very easily be under the illusion of self-sufficiency. But we come up against it and realize, I can't do it. But God can. We have to turn it over to Him and let Him do that. We also have to start to do what we can do. We have to do those things that we can do. Put in God's hands to turn the results over to God. That's what we mean when we're talking about turning it over, is put the results in God's hands. Trust in Him and He will direct your path, and let God bring about the result. But does that mean that there's never anything for us to do? No. See, one of the things that can result in deep depression and frustration and depression is kind of an aimless sense of just kind of wandering and drifting. No goals. We need goals. We need that sense of achievement and accomplishment. God has built within us that, and the very opposite of a sense of frustration and depression and discouragement is a sense of satisfaction and accomplishment and achievement. We're told in Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 19, the desire accomplished is sweet to the soul. It feels good to set a goal and achieve it. Feels good. The desire accomplished is sweet to the soul. You know, what did God do when He finished the creation of the heavens and earth? You remember what He did late Friday afternoon? Same thing you'd have done if you'd been working hard on something all week. Or at least what you would have felt like doing. What do? You finally finish. You step back and you look at it. And you feel good. There's a high that comes. Sense of exhilaration from, I did that. Looks pretty good. You know what God did at the end of creation week, late Friday afternoon, as the sun was setting, Jerusalem time, and there in the area of the Garden of Eden, as He stood there and He beheld, it says, the Lord God beheld all that He had made. And behold, it was very good. That's what God did, see. As He completed the creation, He stepped back and looked at it. And He took pleasure in it. And anybody who's ever accomplished something, what do you feel like doing? You want to step back and look at it, and you feel good. God has built within us that need. The desire accomplished is sweet to the soul. So we need to start to do what we can do. We need to set realistic goals. See, the goal needs to be high enough that you have to reach for it so that you feel some satisfaction when you've accomplished it, but it needs to be low enough that it's obtainable. It needs to be realistic. To set a goal that is so gigantic and so far out that you're never going to do it is just to set yourself up for failure. Depending on our circumstances, depending on where we are in our life, depending on a variety of things, the goals have to be realistic for us. What's realistic for somebody else is not necessarily realistic for me or for you. So we have to set them based on what we can do. And the desire accomplished is sweet to the soul. The final key, the seventh key, is to focus in on the reality of the hope that is before us. Hebrews 11 and 12 I would refer you to. I think a very powerful section of Scripture in terms of focusing in on the reality of the hope that is before us. As we approach the fall festival season, the meaning, the whole intent and meaning and focus of the fall festival season is on the reality of the hope that is before us. Jesus Christ is really going to come back to this earth, and the government of God is really going to be established, and we can really have a part in that. There is a hope. How did the men and women of God go through the things they went through? Hebrews 11, you read of the individuals of faith who lived and died in faith, not having received the promises, but they saw them afar off. And we're told in Hebrews 12, wherefore, seeing we also are encompassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that does so easily beset us. And let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before Him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is now set down on the right hand of the throne of God. Consider Him that endured such a contradiction of sinners against Himself, lest you be wearied and faint in your minds. Come to the end of your rope and give up. You've not yet resisted unto blood striving against sin. You've forgotten the exhortation that speaks unto you, my son, despise not the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when you're rebuked of Him for whom the Lord loves. He chastens and scourges every son whom He receives. If you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons, for what son is he whom the Father chastens not? Now, verse 11, no chastening for the present seems to be joyous, but rather grievous. Nevertheless, afterward it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to them that are exercised thereby. Now, we're told, even in Hebrews 10, we have need of patience. That after we've done the will of God, we will receive the promise. Hebrews 10:36. Yet a little while, and He that shall come will come and will not tarry. Things really are going to happen. God's plan is really going to be accomplished. We have to look for a city that has foundations, whose maker and builder is God. We've got to have our eyes set on hope. There are various things that can lead into serious discouragement and deep depression. Overwhelming tasks and goals, unexpected events in our life, unexpected results that lead us into self-pity, which can slide down into depression. A lack of sense of purpose, just an aimless drifting. A lack of tangible goals to work for. And the very real role of Satan. Any of those factors can lead into serious depression. But there are things we can do to cope. It's important to be conscious of the physical necessities and not to neglect them. The diet, the sleep, the regulation of sleep, the exercise, the avoidance of alcohol and other things that can deepen the depression. Being aware of the physical necessities, not neglecting those things. Of seeing and focusing in on the power of God. Cultivating that attitude of gratitude. Seeing a perspective as to why God allows us to go through trials. As a fifth thing, going to God for help, casting our cares on Him. Number 6 is start doing what you can do. Set realistic goals. And focus in, finally, on the hope that is before us. These are things that as we focus in on in the midst of the trials, the difficulties, the adversities that we go through, that we have gone through, and brethren, we will go through. None of us know all the ups and downs and the things we're going to face, and ultimately we know not only as individuals, but as a church, as a group, collectively as God's people, we're going to go through a time of great stress. The whole world is going to go through a time of great tribulation and trial. But God gives us keys that can be helpful to us in surviving and thriving and focusing in on the reality of the promises God has before us.